chess career of Steinitz. William Steinitz was born in Prague in 1836. He learned the rules of chess when he was 12 and soon became an enthusiastic student of the game. At the age of 20, he travelled to Vienna to further his education. However, his academic studies and his early attempts to make a living were severely hindered by poor eyesight, and Steinitz devoted himself more and more to chess. Of the era in which Steinitz began his chess career, Lasker wrote in his Manual of Chess,
"At that time, everybody thought that victory in chess was gained by ingenuity alone."
Steinitz soon proved to be well endowed with ingenuity. Acknowledged champion of Austria in 1861, Steinitz was selected to represent that country in the London International Tournament of 1862, where he finished sixth in a field of the world's strongest players. His play at that time was acclaimed for its exceptional brilliance. Even Adolf Anderssen, author of the famous Immortal and Evergreen games, declared that Steinitz had won the most brilliant game of the tournament. Stop the tape and set up the pieces in the initial position, with white in front of you. Steinitz was white, and his opponent was Mongredienne. White opened 1 pawn to e4, and his opponent replied pawn to d5, the center counter. After white pawn takes d5, black recaptured queen takes d5, and white played knight to c3, attacking black's queen. Black retreated, queen to d8. Modern centre counterers would prefer to put the queen on a5 when well-researched complications follow. After Mongredienne's move, Steinitz continued 4 pawn to d4, with an advantage in both space and development. In the further course of the opening, white maintains these advantages. There followed black pawn to e6, white knight to f3, black knight to f6, white bishop to d3, black bishop to e7. Now white castled, and black castled. The white bishop went to e3, and black played pawn to b6. White began to dominate the centre. 9, white knight to e5. Black bishop to b7. White pawn to f4. Black knight from b8 to d7. White queen to e2. Black knight to d5. Switch off the tape and think about this position for a while. This move soon leads to difficulties for black. He should have challenged the white centre with pawn to c5, trying to open lines on the queen side and in the centre, so as to divert white from his plans of attacking on the king's side. After the move played, Steinitz exchanged 12, white knight takes d5. And now black made a further mistake. He recaptured with the pawn, e takes d5. Had he recaptured with the bishop instead, it is true, White would have retained the stronger grip on the centre, but by allowing the centre to become blocked, Black further encourages a kingside assault. White continued Rook to f3, reaching the position of diagram 1. Can you see his threat? Stop the tape and try to work it out. White threatened 14, bishop takes h7, check. Black king takes h7. White rook to h3, check. And next move, White's queen will go to h5 with a mating attack. Stop the tape and return the pieces to the position of diagram 1. Here Black essayed pawn to f5, and there followed White rook to h3, Black pawn to g6, White pawn to g4. White is trying to open lines of attack against the enemy king. How should Black defend? Stop the tape and work out the best plan. Black should try knight takes e5, followed by bishop c8. This would enable him to maintain a barrier at f5, as well as exchanging the threatening white knight. Replace Black's bishop at b7 and his knight at d7, and White's at e5. Here Black actually chose 15, pawn takes g4, and succumbed to a violent combination. White's reply to this move, as you should have worked out when considering Black's alternative's last move, was the sacrifice 16, White rook takes h7. And Black tried to stem the attacking tide by exchanging knight takes e5. But to no avail. There followed White pawn from f4 takes e5. Black king takes h7. White queen takes g4. Black rook to g8. White queen to h5, check. Black king to g7. White queen to h6, check. It would have been a gross blunder for White to play queen takes g6, check, as Black's reply would leave the White queen pinned along the g-file. After the move chosen, Black has no escape. He played king to f7, and White replied queen to h7, check, reaching the position of diagram 2. Now, on Black rook to g7, White would reply bishop takes g6, check, whereupon Black king to e6 is met by White queen to h3, mate, and Black king to f8 is answered by bishop to h6, winning quickly. Stop the tape and return to the position of diagram 2. Black played his king to e6, and there followed White queen to h3 check. Black king to f7. White rook to f1 check. Black king to e8. White queen to e6. This quiet move, in a position that Steinitz must have visualized 8 moves before, is decisive. Black replied rook to g7. Switch off the tape and think about this position for a while. Now, White had a choice of wins. He could have played bishop to b5 check, or bishop to h6, but instead he chose the subtler bishop to g5. The finish was black queen to d7, white bishop takes g6 check, black rook takes g6, white queen takes g6 check, black king to d8, white rook to f8 check, black queen to e8, white queen takes e8, mate. After the tournament of 1862, Steinitz settled in London and began a chess career of unparalleled success and longevity. Success, that is to say, in terms of results, as in those days financial rewards were low and poverty commonplace for the chess professional. He played a number of offhand games in the chess cafes which existed in London at the time, often giving great odds. There were also several minor matches, in one of which he beat this same Mongredien by 7 games to 0. In 1866, Steinitz arranged a match with the redoubtable Adolf Anderssen for stakes of £100 a side. Much to the surprise of everybody, he won by 8 games to 6. From this time onward, he regarded himself as the world's strongest player, and did not lose a serious match for over a quarter of a century. His contemporaries were not unduly impressed by the result of the Anderssen match. The games were not to the public liking. To the commentators, it seemed as though the brilliance of Steinitz's play had begun to fade. What had happened to the Austrian Morphy? Anderssen himself was probably one of the very few people to interpret the evidence correctly at that time. For, despite his own reputation for brilliancy, Anderssen was in fact one of the very few players who had any insight into positional chess, and he, just possibly, could discern the emergence of Steinitz the thinker, Steinitz the architect of vast schemes on the chessboard. Steinitz was not to explain himself clearly for many years, but in the International Chess Magazine of 1891 he wrote,
"When I first met Anderssen, I expressed myself in very derogatory terms about Paulsen's style of play. Some of the games which I saw Paulsen play during the London Congress of 1862 gave a start to the modification of my opinions, and I began to recognize that chess genius is not confined to brilliant finishing strokes."
The extra dimension of genius that Steinitz came to recognize in Paulsen lay in the latter's strategical insight. Paulsen was not merely lurking and grovelling, as Steinitz had at first supposed. He was in fact pursuing strategical themes of great consistency during the course of his seemingly turgid games. Steinitz entered the new dimension to which Paulsen had opened his eyes. He turned the force of his academically trained mind to the problems of positional play, and began to devote his games to ideas beyond the grasp of his contemporaries. He studied the games of Paulsen and learned about the power of the two bishops. See Game 2 in the supplement for an example of Paulsen's play. He also learned the contributions of Philidor, La Bourdonnais, and Morphy, related, respectively, to the importance of pawns, control of the centre, and the importance of mobility. In 1872, a match was arranged between Steinitz and Zukertort, a tremendously gifted player of what Steinitz had come to regard as the old school. Zukertort specialized in straightforward development and straightforward attacking play. Steinitz won by 7 wins to 1 loss, with 4 draws. In 1873, Steinitz entered the strong match tournament held at Vienna that year, tying for first place with the tournament tiger Blackburn. When he defeated Blackburn by 2-0 in the playoff, he had just achieved an unprecedented series of 16 straight wins. And now everyone had to acknowledge his claim to the World Championship, unofficial though such a title was at the time. On his return to London, after this tournament, Steinitz became the chess columnist for the Field magazine, and at last began to reveal the fruits of his intensive study. From this time onward, he was to write in many publications: the Field, the International Chess Magazine, and eventually a book, The Modern Chess Instructor, which was devoted mainly to opening analyses. Steinitz adopted the name the Modern School to describe the more or less novel group of ideas which he had synthesized into an entire system of play. In The Modern Chess Instructor, he states,
"The principal thesis of the modern school may be briefly summarized thus. Among first-class masters, the capture of the adverse king is the ultimate, but not the first object of the game, and by best play on both sides, a draw ought to be the legitimate result."
The first great breakthrough Steinitz made in chess thinking was his concept of the balance of position. His opponents of the 1860s and 1870s knew how to attack, but not how to maintain a positional equilibrium, nor what was entailed in such a notion. They were aware of the concrete tactical features of the game, but could not discern the landmarks of ultimate success or failure, as could Steinitz. Steinitz looked at the chessboard and foresaw what would be decisive 10, 20, or 30 moves hence.
Irrespective of an attack against the adverse king, the mere weakness of any square on any part of the board will cause great inconvenience and trouble, and very often will be fatal.
Thus, the modern chess instructor. Poor Zukertort, such a player, and yet his skill and intuition were as nothing against the understanding of Steinitz. Steinitz was busy solving problems of which Zukertort was not even aware. Again, Steinitz.
Even the sound combinations that involve great sacrifices very rarely present difficulties as great as the maintenance of the balance of the position, and the strategy required in leading up to the final winning process.
Did Zukertort even dream that such a thing existed as the balance of position? Let us examine one of the games from the match of 1872. Stop the tape and set up the pieces in the initial position, with the black pieces in front of you. Steinitz was black. In this, the 5th game of the match, he adopted his own Steinitz defense to the relevés. The game began white pawn to e4, black pawn to e5, white knight to f3, black knight to c6, white bishop to b5, black pawn to a6, white bishop to a4, black knight to f6, white pawn to d3, black pawn to d6. In this position, white captured. 6, bishop takes c6, check. Thus is the balance of position upset. White cedes the 2 bishops and encourages the black pawn to recapture towards the centre. The move is not necessarily intrinsically bad, since corresponding advantages for white may arise. Black's hold over the d4 square is decreased, and his king-bishop undeveloped. Therefore, if white can mobilize his forces rapidly and break with pawn to d4, he should fare adequately in the ensuing struggle. However, Zukertort fails to realize such a plan. There now came black pawn and b7 takes c6, white pawn to h3, black pawn to g6, white knight to c3. Switch off the tape and think about this position for a while. A more consistent plan for white was to castle, followed with pawn to c3 and pawn to d4, a plan which the chosen move hinders. After white's knight to c3, there came black bishop to g7, white bishop to e3, black pawn to c5. Typical STEINITZ. His moves are functional, even at the cost of time in development. This notion of functional development appears to clash with the basic tenet of opening play, the need to develop all one's pieces quickly, which the chess world had learned from the examples set by Paul Morphy. But time counts for less enclosed positions. By playing pawn to c5, black prevents pawn to d4 by his opponent, and white's pieces find they have nowhere to go. Now white continued 10, queen to d2, intending bishop to h6 with a kingside attack. To prevent this, Steinitz replied, black pawn to h6. Provocative. It will be a while before black is able to castle. Zukertort tried another tack, with white rook to b1. The position is now very reminiscent of the famous 13th game in Steinitz's match with Anderson in 1866. This game is given in the supplement. Then, too, Anderson could see nothing better than the illusion of a queenside attack with rook to b1 and pawn to b4. Switch off the tape and think about this plan for a while. Steinitz's views about attacking were a direct outcome of his conception of the balance of position. These views can be summarized as follows. Firstly, An attack is justified only when the balance of position is disturbed to the advantage of the attacking party. Secondly, he who holds the advantage must attack, or his advantage will be dissipated. Thirdly, and very important, the direction of the attack will depend on those factors that cause the equilibrium to be disturbed in the first place. In the present case, White has already forfeited his option of an attack by pawn to d4, and the manoeuvre commenced with rook to b1 scarcely exploits any weakness in the black camp. In the Anderson game already mentioned, as well as the present game, Steinitz conclusively demonstrates the aimlessness of White's plan by ignoring diversion entirely. He continued functionally and provocatively with black knight to g8. White now found himself provoked into a gesture on the king's side. 12, white knight to h2. Black knight to e7. White pawn to f4. Black e takes f4. White bishop takes f4. Black pawn to g5. Yet another pawn move. Black is slowly strangling his opponent. The balance of position sways in his favour. 15, white bishop to e3. Black pawn to f5. This is the position of diagram 3, and Zukertort must by now have been quite bewildered. Should he despair with 16, bishop takes g5, black h takes g5, white queen takes g5, but to what end? Or should he exchange, again from diagram 3, 16, white e takes f5, black knight takes f5, white castles, black castles, white bishop to f2, but nothing is attractive anymore. Stop the tape and return to the position of diagram 3. White in fact played 16 castles, allowing black to gain an iron grip on the position. There followed black pawn to f4, white bishop to f2, black knight to c6, white knight to d5, black castles, white pawn to b4, black c takes b4, white knight takes b4, black knight takes b4, white rook takes b4, black bishop to e6. Here Zukertort proffered a pawn in order to challenge the pressure exerted by black's fianchettoed bishop. He played 22, white bishop to d4. Black bishop takes d4. white rook takes d4. No doubt, white was hoping that black would take at a2 with the bishop, when white could obtain counterplay along the a file and in the centre by rook to a4 and a possible pawn to d4. Switch off the tape and think about this. Steinitz calmly continued with black pawn to c5, forcing white to play rook to a4, and now all the important lines and squares fall into black's hands. Black queen to b6, white pawn to c4, black pawn to a5, white rook to a3, black pawn to a4, white rook to c3, black rook from f8 to b8, white rook to c2, black queen to c7, white rook to b2, black pawn to a3, white rook from b2 to b1, black queen to g7. Switch off the tape and look at this position for a while. Quite decisive, black's masterly manoeuvring has left his opponent with no defence to the threat of black rook to b2, and so Zukertort gave a short convulsion. White rook takes b8 check. Black rook takes b8. White queen to a5. Black queen to d4 check. White king to h1. Black queen takes d3. White queen to c7. Black rook to b1. White queen to d8 check. Black king to f7. Here white resigned. His checks are exhausted. After 36, white queen to c7 check. Black king to g6. Having announced his basic concept of the balance of position, Steinitz began to study the different factors that can constitute an advantage for one side when this balance is disturbed, and how to exploit those advantages. He discovered the temporary advantages of local piece superiority, control of open lines, the power of a phalanx of pawns advancing abreast. He discovered the permanent advantages, such as material advantage or fixed pawn weaknesses. And he explained how one ought to attack, by judicious use of weak points. He understood constriction and blockade techniques later to be used by Nimzowitsch. He advocated the accumulation of small advantages and the conversion of temporary advantages into permanent advantages. Steinitz also made great strides in the realm of defensive strategy, accepting and surviving on occasion the most horrific positions. He recognized both that the king is a strong piece, and attacks can often be refuted if the attacker can be induced to overplay his hand. Above all, Steinitz was loath to make weakening pawn moves in the name of defense. Here is how Lasker describes the Steinitzian defensive technique.
He who is at a disadvantage must be willing to defend himself. He must be willing to make a concession. But his guiding principle must be the principle of economy. Hence, he must seek to make the concession that just suffices, and not an ounce more. Steinitz also points the way to the defender who asks himself how to achieve this end. He advises, improve the worst weakness voluntarily. The ideal of a position for defense is that all of its lines of resistance be equally strong.
Aside from a match with Blackburn, held at London in 1876 and won 7-0 by Steinitz, Steinitz was inactive as far as over-the-board play is concerned between 1873 and 1882. His biographer, Charles Davide, gives two reasons for this quiescence.
Steinitz was altogether taken up by his editorial duties and his bodily ailments. On one occasion, he arose from the sickbed with permanent lameness in one of his legs.
Nevertheless, despite his conspicuous lack of practice, the 46-year-old Steinitz tied with Simon Winnaar for first place in the Vienna tournament of 1882. The field included his old rivals Paulsen, Blackburn, Zukertort, and the English player Bird, as well as the ascendant Russian star Mikhail Tchigorin. However, after losing the thread of the winning game in his playoff match with Winnaar, Steinitz had to be content with shared honours. In the London tournament of 1883, Steinitz was better prepared. Between this and the Vienna tournament, he had undertaken a tour of America, giving many exhibitions. At London, he was able to combine his positional insight with the demands of over-the-board play more harmoniously than heretofore. Here is one of his games from the tournament, illustrating the technique of acquiring and converting small advantages. Stop the tape and set up the pieces in the initial position with white in front of you. Steinitz's opponent was Mortimer. The game began 1 white pawn to d4, black pawn to d5, white pawn to c4, black pawn to e6, white knight to c3, black knight to f6, white knight to f3, black pawn to c5, white pawn to e3, black knight to c6, white bishop to d3, black bishop to d6, white castles. Switch off the tape and think about this position for a while. A modest enough opening. Steinitz refuses to overpress at an early stage, but waits for his opponent to go wrong, which he duly begins to do. Black continued 7 knight to e7, and after white d takes c5, black bishop takes c5, white knight to a4, he played black pawn to b6, allowing white to gain the small advantage of the two bishops. There followed white knight takes c5, black b takes c5, white pawn to b3, black knight to g6, white bishop to b2, black castles, white rook to c1, black bishop to b7, switch off the tape and try to work out how white should continue. Here, Steinitz found a combination, giving up the two bishops to gain the more lasting advantage of a pawn plus. He played 14 c takes d5, and black replied queen takes d5. Otherwise, the black c-pawn falls at once. Then came white bishop at b2 takes f6, black g takes f6, white bishop takes g6, black h takes g6, white queen takes d5, black bishop takes d5, white rook takes c5, and here Mortimer sought compensation in the weakening of white's kingside pawn structure by 18 black bishop takes f3. White replied g takes f3, black king g7, white rook to d1, black rook to h8. Switch off and think about this ending. Steinitz continued logically with rook to d7, threatening to double rooks on the 7th rank, again compelling a black to defend. There now followed black rook from h8 to d8, white rook from c5 to c7, black rook takes d7, white rook takes d7, black pawn to e5, white rook to c7, black pawn to f5, white king to f1, black king to f6, white king to e2, black king to e6, white rook to c6 check, black king to d7, white rook to f6, black rook to f8, white pawn to h4, black king to e7, white rook to a6, black rook to a8, white pawn to b4. Now, in desperation, black played 31 rook to h8, but the subsequent exchange of black's a-pawn for white's h-pawn left black without resource against the advance of the connected passed pawns on the queen side. Despite calm and logical play such as this, Steinitz was unable to win the London tournament. With 19.5 points, he placed second behind Zukertort, who had amassed an outstanding 22 points. Chess Career of Steinitz, Part 2. In the 19th century, there existed no official mechanism of recognition for the World Chess Championship. The chess public was in the habit of acclaiming the winner of the most recent important tournament as the best player. Steinitz, especially, had his detractors. Thus, in the aftermath of the London tournament of 1883, many people acclaimed Zukertort as the brightest star in the chess firmament. This was unfair to Steinitz. By the nature of his style, Zukertort was able to beat nearly all his contemporaries with ease. His intuition was sounder, his tactical mastery more secure. Steinitz, on the other hand, was able to beat absolutely all his contemporaries, but with less ease. He relied not on intuition and tactics, but on deep thought and understanding. So, when Steinitz moved to America in 1884 to take up permanent residence there, it was with a feeling of having been unjustly belittled. He agitated for a second match with Zukertort to prove his superiority. In 1886, that match came about, the games being played in the three cities of New York, St. Louis, and New Orleans. Zukertort started with tremendous energy. Steinitz resisted stubbornly. Zukertort's streak of wins tailed off. Steinitz began to come back. Steinitz began to dominate, and finished triumphantly with a string of victories that made the final score 10-5 in his favour, with 5 draws. Zukertort was completely broken by the match, mentally and physically. He died 2 years later. Steinitz, at 50, was Zukertort's senior by 7 years, a cripple with poor eyesight, and yet his stamina and determination at the chessboard were to remain with him for many years still. The remainder of Steinitz's career is marked by an amazing show of willpower. He clung stubbornly to certain opening variations which were indubitably inferior. He pursued his positional ideas to seemingly absurd lengths, and yet he was to retain the World Championship for another 8 years. During this period, he eschewed tournament play, but undertook 3 matches. In 1889, Steinitz played the 38-year-old Russian genius Tchigorin, winning by 10 games to 6, with 1 draw. And in 1890, he played the talented Isidor Gunsberg, winning by 6 games to 4, with 9 draws. This result, of course, does not show Steinitz at his best. In the International Chess magazine, in 1891, he was moved to comment,
"To all appearances, my old powers are on the wane."
Nevertheless, in 1892, he won a second match against Tchigorin by 10 games to 8, with 5 draws. It was not until, in 1894, at the age of 58, Steinitz played the 25-year-old Emanuel Lasker, that he finally proved unable to summon up the energy to win. Lasker defeated him by 10 games to 5, with 4 draws, and in the return match held in 1896, Lasker won by the huge margin of 10 games to 2, with 5 draws. Steinitz was not quite finished. At the age of 62, he entered the grueling 36-round Vienna tournament of 1898 and achieved 4th place behind Tarasch, Pillsbury and Janowski, an attainment for a veteran approached only by Lasker himself in the much shorter tournaments of Zurich 1934 and Moscow 1935. A year later, however, in the London tournament of 1899, Steinitz could only place 11th. Steinitz returned to New York. For most of his life he had been poor and troubled by ill health. Now, penniless, he began to suffer from delusions. He was placed in an institution on Ward's Island, where he died a few months later, in June of the year 1900. Steinitz bequeathed the chess world a rich and intriguing legacy of games and ideas. It can fairly be said that, unaided, although perhaps encouraged during his stay in England by his friend Potter, but on the whole vociferously opposed, Steinitz advanced chess understanding by decades. Lasker considered himself a disciple of Steinitz, stating in the preface to his Manual of Chess,
"In this book, principally, I desire to explain and extend the theory of Steinitz."
Not all of Steinitz's researches have stood the test of time. One of his more remarkable innovations was the Steinitz gambit. Stop the tape and set up the chess pieces with white facing you. Steinitz played on many occasions 1 white pawn to e4, black pawn to e5, white knight to c3, black knight to c6, white pawn to f4, black e takes f4, white pawn to d4. This permits, in fact cries out for, black queen to h4 check, forcing white's king to e2. This is the position of diagram 4. Steinitz invented this remarkable gambit in 1867, commenting,
"The main object of the gambit is to make the king available for both wings in the endgame."
Profundity or lunacy? Certainly Steinitz notched up some notable victories with the gambit, amongst his victims being Paulsen, Zukertort and Neumann. But surely it is in practice a handicap to adopt such an opening. Steinitz, however, seems to have taken a capricious delight in defending this position. He played it 3 times in the opening stages of the London 1883 tournament. In the first game, his opponent, Winauer, continued from diagram 4 with black pawn to d6. There followed white, knight to f3, black bishop to g4, white bishop takes f4, black castles, white king to e3. A good move. White threatens the black queen and prepares to develop his king's bishop. Winauer played black bishop takes f3, and after white queen takes f3, black pawn to f5, white pawn to d5, black knight from c6 to e7, white king to d2, black f takes e4, white knight takes e4. Winnow complied in his opponent's designs by black knight to f6, white knight to g5, black queen to h5, white queen takes h5, black knight takes h5, white knight to f7, and Steinitz eventually won. He was not so fortunate in the games that followed. Stop the tape and return the pieces to the position of diagram 4. The games Steinitz v English and Steinitz v Tchigorin both continued black pawn to d5, white e takes d5, black queen to e7, check, white king to f2, black queen to h4, check, white pawn to g3, black f takes g3, check, white king to g2, black bishop to d6. Stop the tape and consider this position. Here, against English, Steinitz essayed white pawn takes c6. In the game with Tchigorin, Steinitz improved by white queen to e1 check, but remained with a material deficit which eventually cost him the game anyway. After white pawn takes c6, English continued black g takes h2, and now white cannot play knight to f3 because of black bishop to h3 mate. So Steinitz played instead white queen to f3, allowing black h takes g1 check, white king takes g1, black queen takes d4 check, white bishop to e3, black queen to f6, and black soon won. These 2 points cost Steinitz dear in the tournament, allowing his rival Zukertort to forge ahead. After this experience, Steinitz came down to earth and played more sensible openings, such as that in the game against Mortimer, which we looked at on side 1. Stop the tape and return the pieces to the initial position. The next game we are going to look at is the 4th game with Tchigorin from the match of 1889. Steinitz was white. The game began white pawn to d4, black pawn to d5, white knight to f3, black bishop to g4, white pawn to c4, black bishop takes f3, white g takes f3. Tchigorin persistently adopted this inferior line throughout the match with Steinitz. Steinitz considered that the strengthening of his centre and the acquisition of the two bishops more than compensated for his broken king side. He was, of course, quite correct. There followed black pawn to e6, white c takes d5, black queen takes d5. And here it was better to recapture with the pawn. Tchigorin, a player of the old school, prefers to seek active piece play, but at too great a cost. Steinitz seized the centre with white pawn to e4, and the game ran black bishop to b4 check, white knight to c3, black queen to a5, white bishop to d2, black knight to c6. The time is ripe for black's opening transgressions to be punished. Stop the tape and try to find white's next few moves. Steinitz played white pawn to d5, black e takes d5, white pawn to a3. Now, if the bishop retreats, white will win the black queen by moving his knight to a4. So Tchigorin was committed to a sacrificial line. He played black knight to d4, and Steinitz calmly responded white bishop to d3. Tchigorin sought further complications with black castles, and there followed white a takes b4, black knight takes f3 check, white queen takes f3, black queen takes a1 check, white king to e2, black queen takes b2. Stop the tape and think about this position. Black has a rook and 3 pawns for 2 bishops, and white's king is in the centre. Nevertheless, black is quite lost. It is he, not white, who will succumb to an attack. White has all his pieces developed, with a wealth of open lines and targets to operate against. Play continued. White rook to b1, black queen to a3, white knight to b5, black queen to a6, white queen takes f7, black queen to b6, white rook to c1. This is the position of diagram 5. If black tries pawn to c6, white wins by either e takes d5 or bishop to e3, and if then black pawn to d4, comes white queen to e6 check, black rook to d7, white bishop takes d4. Stop the tape and replace the pieces in the position of diagram 5. There followed black knight to h6, white queen takes g7, black d takes e4, white queen takes c7 check, black queen takes c7, white rook takes c7 check, black king to b8, white bishop takes e4, and black resigned. Of course, this lopsided struggle is far from typical of Tchigorin's play, but it does exemplify Steinitz's tactical awareness. He was not averse to winning quickly. On the other hand, what we should remember Steinitz for most of all are his achievements in the field of strategy. The following epic game comes from a late stage of the 1894 match with Lasker, the 17th game. Steinitz, bowed but not yet beaten, was black. Stop the tape and set up the pieces. The game opened white pawn to e4, black pawn to e5, white knight to f3, black knight to c6, white bishop to c4, black bishop to c5, white pawn to d3, black knight to f6, white knight to c3, black pawn to d6, white bishop to e3, black bishop to b6, white queen to d2, black knight to a5. Davide remarks that Steinitz always thought this manoeuvre, in conjunction with the exchange of both white's bishops, leads to an advantage for black, but that Tarrasch and others considered the resultant half-open files to more than compensate white for his doubled pawns. Lasker's choice of the slow Giuoco piano opening is probably based on the psychological considerations of his lead in the match and his opponent's age. In a long struggle, surely Steinitz will collapse first. Steinitz, however, never objected to a struggle, and here he produces a real positional masterpiece. Lasker's eighth move was white bishop to b5 check. He would have done better to retreat to b3 at once, as after the check, black doesn't mind advancing his queenside pawns. Black pawn to c6. White bishop to a4. Black bishop takes e3. White f takes e3. Black pawn to b5. White bishop to b3. Black queen to b6. White castles kingside. Black knight to g4. White rook from a1 to e1. How would you evaluate the respective prospects in this position? Switch off and think about it. Here, Steinitz played black pawn to f6, assuring himself a completely secure strong point in the centre. This was the idea behind his previous knight move, and when the knight eventually retreats to f7, white will have no point of attack either in the centre or on the king's side. Steinitz often used the strong point strategy in his games. With the pawn firmly established at king 4 or queen 4, activities can be undertaken on the wing. Here, black will use the queen side. In other games, Steinitz used a strong point centre as the basis for a kingside attack. See, for example, the famous fourth game of his second match with Tchigorin, appended in the supplement. If ever white advances pawn to d4, he will only weaken the pawn at e4 and threaten nothing, a strategical concept of play against double pawns which Nimzowitsch was later to make great use of. So it seems that your assessment should have been that white has a small disadvantage due to his doubled e-pawns, without much possibility of compensation elsewhere. Steinitz is right and Tarrasch wrong. There followed white pawn to h3, black knight to h6, white knight to e2, black knight takes b3, white a takes b3, black castles, white knight to g3, black pawn to a5, white pawn to d4. This is bad. He should have tried rook to a1, or undertaken something on the king's side, since he can achieve nothing in the centre. Now there came black knight to f7, white queen to f2, black rook to a7. Black's position is superbly flexible, ready for anything. White could try knight to h4 here, but instead pretends his central advance had some point. He played 20 white rook to d1. Steinitz began to show his hand, with black pawn to to a4. There followed white pawn to b4, black queen to c7, white knight to e1, black pawn to c5, white queen to d2. Had white instead played knight to d3, black could reply pawn to c4, followed by pawn to c3. After white's queen to d2, black played bishop to e6. Stop the tape and think about this position. Now Lasker decided, perhaps wrongly, to block the centre with white pawn to d5. Certainly there is no advantage to be gained by opening the d-file, since black has all the entry squares well covered. On the other hand, this clarification of the central tension also favours black. The doubled e-pawns are left backward and weak. Nimzovich's theories must owe much to an examination of games such as these. One of his recommendations was that you should tempt pawns adjacent to double pawns to advance. Indeed, Steinitz's games far more resemble those of Nimzovich than they do those of Tarrasch, although both claim to be Steinitz's disciples. But in the running battle between Tarrasch and Nimzovich, the shade of Steinitz must have favoured the teachings of the latter. The game went on. Black bishop to d7, white rook to a1, black c takes b4, white queen takes b4, black rook to c8, white queen to d2, black queen to c4, white rook to f2, black knight to g5. Another strong move. Steinitz steadily increases his pressure against the weak pawns and tempts further weaknesses. Such positions are very hard to defend. White played queen to d3, and after black's reply rook a7 to c7, could find nothing better than white pawn to h4, black knight to f7, white queen takes c4, black rook takes c4. Stop the tape and think about this. Now, white's kingside suffers what Nimzovich would call a reflex weakness, the hole at g4. Nor has the exchange of queens relieved the pressure down the c-file. In the manoeuvres that follow, Steinitz patiently outplays his formidable opponent. 32. White rook to d2. Black pawn to g6. White king to f2, black knight to d8. This knight is now scheduled for work on the queen's side. One more piece in that quarter will precipitate the breakthrough. White pawn to b3. Black rook from c4 to c7. White rook from d2 to d1. Black knight to b7. White rook from d1 to b1. Black king to f7. White king to e2. Black rook to a8. White king to d2. Black knight to a5. With a threat, switch off and try to find it. Black was threatening, a takes b3, white, c takes b3, black, knight takes b3, check. White is confronted with another problem. If he ever exchanges on a4, the open b file can only favour his opponent, and to play pawn to b4 would yield back a protected passed a pawn as well as the square c4. So Lasker played 39, white king to d3, and Steinitz replied, black pawn to h5. A typical restraining move on the king's side. White's knights have nowhere to go. Now came white rook to a2. Black rook a8 to a7, with another threat. This time black intends a takes b3, white c takes b3, black knight takes b3, white rook takes a7, black knight to c5 check, followed by recapturing the rook. Replace the pieces. Black's rooks on a7 and c7, white's on a2, white pawns at c2 and b3, black's pawn at a4, and black's knight at a5. Here, Lasker committed himself with white pawn to b4, a last attempt to block the queen's side. Now black's knight moved in, knight to c4, and both sides regrouped. White, knight to f3, black rook to a8, white knight to d2, black knight to b6, white rook to f1, black rook from a8 to c8, white knight to b1, black king to e7, white pawn to c3, black knight to c4, white rook from a2 to f2. This is the position of diagram 6. Superficially, it seems that white has made progress. He is threatening, for the first time in the game, to capture something, and appears to have created some defensive chances for himself on the queen side. But in fact the final collapse is very near. Can you see black's next move? Stop the tape and try to work out how black continued. Steinitz played black knight to a3. The hard-working knight, fittingly, administers the coup de grace. Now, if white plays rook takes f6, there follows black knight takes b1, white rook to f7, check, black king to d8, white rook takes b1, black rook takes c3, check, white king to e2, black pawn to a3, with decisive effect. Switch off the tape and replace the pieces in the position of diagram 6. After black knight to a3, there followed white knight to e2, black knight takes b1, white rook takes b1, black bishop to g4, white rook to c1, and now Steinitz created a new threat by black rook to c4. This intends black bishop takes e2, followed by rook takes b4, and so Lasker replied 51, white rook to c2, and Steinitz answered pawn to f5. White resigned. Switch off and look at the position. White cannot play e takes f5, as the reply black bishop takes f5 check wins the exchange. And on white knight to g3, black f takes e4 check, white king to d2. Again, if white recaptures, black's bishop f5 is fatal. There will follow the maneuver black bishop to d7 to e8 to f7 takes d5, against which white is quite helpless. This epoch-making and flawless game on Steinitz's part is without doubt one of the finest he ever played, and forms a fitting swan song to one of the most dynamic chess careers the world has seen. The game is played in a style at least 25 years ahead of its time. As a strategist, Steinitz can only be compared with his predecessor Philidor and his descendants Nimzowitsch and Petroshan, and possibly Steinitz was the greatest of them all. Let us, finally, consider a remark of Lasker's. He states, emphatically,
He was a thinker, worthy of a seat in the halls of a university. A player, as the world believed he was not. His studious temperament made that impossible.
In my opinion, Lasker is completely wrong here. The essence of chess playing, as opposed to chess theorizing, is a burning will to win, and such was the essence of Steinitz. He was, first, a player. His greatest achievement was to be world champion for 28 years. A first-class strategical theory is the worthy product of a first-class player, and not vice versa. The eccentricities of Steinitz's play should not, as Lasker presumably supposes, be attributed solely to excesses of academicism. What Lasker fails to recognize in this respect is Steinitz's similarity to himself. As Horowitz remarks in his History of the World Chess Championship,
in practice, both Steinitz and Lasker went to sometimes incredible lengths to induce their opponents to make mistakes.
Steinitz's theory involved the corollary that perfect play should result in a draw. Therefore, although he never stated it, I believe that as a practical player he was the first to perceive the truth which is attributed to the games of Lasker, and which was expressed thus by the present world champion Karpov.
In order to win, one must give the opponent winning chances,
which Steinitz did, and won.